During Lent, I would like to do another sermon series that's based on one of Adam Hamilton's studies. This one's titled Half-Truths, and you gotta love the subtitle. God helps those who help themselves and other things the Bible doesn't say. These are common sayings that may have a measure of truth in them, and some folks may even believe they're in the Bible, but they're not. And yet, some of these sayings may be true in some ways, but they still don't really capture the whole truth, especially as we compare them to what we find in Scripture. So these are the ones we're going to look at. Sayings like, everything happens for a reason, God helps those who help themselves, God won't give you any more than you can handle, God said it, I believe it, that settles it, love the sinner, hate the sin. How many of you have heard all of these in some context? I bet most of us have. Today, we're going to look at the first of these statements, which is everything happens for a reason. Originally, I was going to use a passage from Deuteronomy that Adam uses to start out the study, but I have since moved to a different verse from Romans 8:28, which says this: we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. I think it'd be good for us to read that together, could we? We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. I also have a short 1-minute video that introduces this series. So let's dim the lights and look to the screens.
Sometimes half just doesn't cut it. Some religious beliefs are like that. You've heard the phrases, maybe even said them. They sound true, like everything happens for a reason, or God won't give you more than you can handle. Love the sinner, hate the sin, or God helps those who help themselves. But when we look at them carefully, we see they are only half true. Join us as we discover the whole truth behind half-truths.
I'm okay.
Everything happens for a reason. I have a demonstration. You ready? Now, why did that happen? Gravity? I chose to do it. Physics involved that made the loud noise. So there is some measure of truth in saying that things happen for a reason, right? There are some very good reasons that happened. Adam Hamilton says, the statement, everything happens for a reason, is true if in saying it we mean that we live in a world of cause and effect. Actions create consequences. Our own choices produce results. So there's some truth, some measure of truth in saying everything happens for a reason. But when is it that we most often hear people use this phrase? It's usually when bad things happen. We will hear someone say it when there is an unexplainable tragedy or major loss or a disappointment of some kind. And you'll hear it expressed in different ways, like it was meant to be. Or when somebody dies, it must have been their time. It was part of God's plan, or it must have been God's will. The very worst being that when a child dies, someone might say, God must have needed another angel. Everything happens for a reason. The implication is that when words fail, when there is no reasonable explanation for something awful that's happened, a lot of people are going to assume that God must have had some purpose in making or allowing that bad thing to happen, that God made it happen. I've told you before about a challenging time in my life and within the life of our family. It was the fall of 1996. In September of that year, my grandfather in Texas died. He was my dad's dad. And barely more than a month later, my own dad, who'd been living with a brain tumor for 3 years, died at the age of 55. When doctors in Texas said they couldn't do anything else for him, we flew him and my mom up to our home in Carrier Mills, and he died in our home 10 days after their arrival. But not only that, Jennifer was literally 9+ months pregnant, and we were awaiting Autumn's arrival, which prevented me from going to my dad's funeral in Texas. Autumn was born 6 days after Dad died, only to have major surgery at Cardinal Glennon Hospital 4 weeks later. My head was spinning, my heart was breaking as we navigated our way through all the grief and joy, the fear and anxiety that was overwhelming us. And even though, I'm the pastor in the family, even though I'm the one with the fancy theological training, for the first time in my life, I asked that question that I'm sure so many of you have asked at some point in your life, which is why? Why? Why is my family experiencing so much grief when we'd long anticipated that this would be a time of joy with the birth of a child? Why did my dad die at age 55? Why did he suffer so much? Why does my mother have to kind of start her life over again? Why did my dad not live to see his first grandkid? Why does this precious newborn daughter of ours have to endure surgery and IV tubes and all the pain and complications that go with it? It all seems so unfair. Why, God? Now, I knew in my head that there would never be an adequate or satisfying answer to any of those questions, but my heart couldn't help but keep asking why. You know what I mean? Well, let me tell you, the last thing I would have ever wanted to hear anyone say to me in all of that is that this happened for a reason. In fact, I might have punched you in the face because it really provides no comfort, no solace for the inexplicable pain and suffering of people I love. Everything happens for a reason. What do you think about that? Do you really believe that God is responsible for all the pain and suffering and sorrow we encounter in this world? Do you really believe that? Adam Hamilton suggests that there are 3 problems with this way of thinking. First, it eliminates the concept of personal responsibility for our actions. He says if everything happens according to God's immutable will, then whatever I do must have been God's will. Taken to an extreme, he suggests if I cheat on my wife, it must have been part of God's plan. If I drink and drive and kill someone, it must have been that person's time to go. No, those were personal choices that made those things happen, and you have personal responsibility for them. A second problem with the idea that everything happens for a reason is that, as I've said, it makes God responsible for everyone's actions and everything that happens. Adam says if God actually intended for everything to happen, then God is responsible for every terrible thing that happens in our world. Just skimming the front page of the St. Louis Dispatch from this past week, there's a story of a firefighter, a captain in the fire department in Godfrey who died while battling a fire in a burning home. There's a story of a man who is charged with shooting an Amazon driver over a parking spot. There is an Arizona senator who reveals that she was raped by an officer while serving in the military. Do we say everything happens for a reason? Dare any of us say that this must have been God's will? It's not the God I believe in, and not the God I've come to know in Jesus Christ. A third problem, this kind of thinking can lead to fatalism and indifference. Fatalism means that there's nothing you can do to stop or change your circumstances. It's inevitable. It's all pre-planned. A fatalist thinks whatever is going to happen, whatever will be, will be. We are powerless to change it. And that leads to indifference, a why bother attitude. Why eat healthy foods or exercise because you're going to die anyway? Why wear a seatbelt in my car if God knows when it's going to be my time? Does everything really happen for a reason? Honestly, some bad things, a lot of bad things happen because of our personal choices, bad mistakes. And yes, there are some things that happen because God influences or intervenes in our lives or in our world. But the God we know in Jesus Christ isn't a God who inflicts pain or incites disaster or imposes unnecessary suffering for some unknown or mysterious reason. it is also true, and sadly so, that a lot of things happen just because, for no logical reason or purpose. You know, if a tornado rips through a town and kills some folks, like in Alabama this past week, that's not anything God caused or willed. It's not anything that humans chose to happen. Sometimes bad stuff just happens, and it wasn't God who made it happen for a reason. When some friends of mine had a baby, someone gave them a bib that said, pardon my language now, it said, spit happens. And sometimes there really is no one else to blame. There's no one who caused a tragedy, quite simply, spit happens. And having said that, the verse I read earlier from Romans has long been one of my favorites. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. All things work together for good. Please hear me out. This is quite different from saying everything happens for a reason. The difference may seem small, but it's really quite important. Paul is telling us that God can take the tragedies of life, God can take all the terrible experiences we go through and use them for good, which is really the message of Jesus through his death and his resurrection. Adam Hamilton puts it this way: Paul doesn't say that God makes everything happen for a reason, or whatever happens was part of God's will and plan. Rather, he says that no matter what happens, however bad it may be, God will somehow bring good out of the situation for those who love him. God will force evil to accomplish good. And my friends, that's something I can agree with. That's something I can affirm. Sometimes bad things just happen for whatever reasons, but God can take even the worst of things and use them for some good purpose. Adam adds this thought. He says, God does not generally cause our suffering, but he carries us through it and brings something good from it. He goes on to tell a story being in a meeting one day and got a call to come to the hospital because a 3-year-old boy in his church named Austin had been hit by a car. Adam rushed to the hospital only to be told that Austin had just died. He walked into the emergency room where he found doctors and nurses, tears in their eyes, standing around the family. And then he saw Austin's parents holding their son. One of them spoke and said, "Pastor Adam, would you please baptize Austin? He's never been baptized." So the nurses filled a basin with water, and Adam took Austin into his arms and baptized his lifeless body in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Not because he wouldn't go to heaven otherwise, Adam says, but because his parents need to know that God's covenant covered him and that he was safe in God's loving arms. 20 or so years later, Adam asked Austin's parents if they could share how Austin's death had affected their faith. And his mother, Kathy, wrote this. She says, "At the time, I'd had people tell me that it was Austin's time. And I was having a hard time believing in a God who would plan to take my child at age 3. I've learned that tragedies weren't necessarily part of God's plan, but that God gave us free will and that bad things sometimes happen. Understanding this helped me to turn to God instead of away from him. Since Austin's death, I believe that my faith has grown and continues to grow. His death changed the way I view God and my faith. I no longer have a naive, childlike faith where God protects you from all harm and makes everything okay. It's a deeper faith that has tested me through tragedy. I know that God doesn't promise me a pain-free life, but he does promise to always be there to love me, comfort me, and guide me. My faith gives me something that people without faith don't have, which is hope. I have hope for the future and the knowledge that I will see Austin again in heaven." You see, God did not cause 3-year-old Austin to get hit by a car and die. God didn't need another angel in heaven, and it wasn't a part of God's plan, and most certainly his death didn't happen for a reason. It was a tragic mix of circumstances and choices that ended this young boy's life, but God used that tragedy to enlarge the hearts of his parents and to deepen their faith. And I'm sure their example has inspired a lot of folks, including me today. You see, as someone who follows Jesus, I believe that I can say quite confidently that God is not the source of all the suffering and tragedy in the world. God does not have a reason for the senseless heartache and loss we often must endure. However, we can know that all things will work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. And the deeper truth is that no matter what happens, God will always be with us. God will always love us. God truly hurts with us. And yes, God can use and transform even the worst of tragedies into new life and new possibilities. A friend of mine posted a meme on Facebook this past week that I've seen before. It's titled A Franciscan Benediction. And I really like what it says. I'm not sure how much it really fits this sermon, but I like it. And I think it's so much more profound than just blithely saying everything happens for a reason. It calls us to look more deeply within ourselves. And I'm going to offer this Franciscan benediction as a closing prayer for this message. It says this: May God bless us with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that we may live from deep within our hearts. May God bless us with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of God's creation, so that we may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless us with tears to shed for those who suffer pain, rejection, hunger, and war, so that we may reach out our hands to comfort them and turn their pain into joy. And may God bless us with just enough foolishness to believe that we can make a difference in the world, so that we can do what others claim cannot be done, to bring justice and kindness to all our children and to all our neighbors who are poor. Amen. Remember our app, our website, findhopedowntown.org, through which you can give, stay connected, or watch sermon videos that you might enjoy.